Welcome, everybody. I'd like to take a little time to give an overview of my latest book, When the Buddha Needs Therapy. It's a little slippery. So, to start things off, this book is very personal, and it was a long time in the making. And I'll give you an example. So we have to go all the way back to the early 90s when I was a young buck of 20 or so. And for some background, for a little context, I was raised in a sort of a traditional, dogmatic, closed-minded, corporal punishment, not very fucking fun Catholic school upbringing. 12 years of Catholic school education, and it kind of sucked. A lot of dogma, a lot of rules, not much room for curiosity. They really believed that you shouldn't ask questions. And they didn't really understand anything luminous about spirituality. It was truly religion, Don't ask questions, keep your head down. And so by the time I was like 14, I was pretty much an atheist. And all through my education, grade school, high school, and then college, I was never exposed to anything mystical, not, the great Sufi poets, Hafiz or Rumi, none of the great Christian mystic writers, just nothing like that, really. So I lived in a world that was pretty narrow, and that presumed any spiritual experience or religious experience, because for me they were kind of the same, was some version of delusion, self-delusion. I was an engineering major, so I was taking all hard science classes. And yet, 20 years old, I'm at my parents' house, I'm visiting them. It's nighttime, it's winter, I get out of the car, I look up, and I see the stars, beautiful stars, right? And I've had this love affair with the stars since I was just a wee little lad. They've always sort of knocked me out of my assurity that I have any idea what's going on. Their vastness, their timelessness, their beauty. And so I was looking up at them, and the most extraordinary thing happened. Pow. I went from being a 20-year-old Keith to being unified with everything. And I was the stars, literally. I literally was the stars. And I was the thing looking at the stars. I was what was being watched, and I was the watcher, both. And there was no Keith anywhere in there. I mean, he was a little tiny thing, actually, and actually that little tiny Keithness was very funny to me as I looked up, and this expansive unity consciousness just consumed me. Because I saw myself, my Keithness, from that perspective, about the size of a grain of sand on an infinitely long beach. And that was funny. My stories, my drama, my self-concern, my self-obsession, right, all that was just suddenly very, very funny. So I burst out laughing. And in the laughter, there was also this tremendous joy, this transcendent bliss, like I'd never experienced before, like genuine, unreasonable joy, tied to nothing, but simply being alive, aware, being aware. So I came out of that, went in, saw my parents, had dinner. It's kind of weird. They probably thought I was high, which I wasn't. But they could be forgiven for perhaps suspecting that. And so I went back to school, back to being an engineering major. But then I started to have anxiety attacks, and panic attacks, and all this shit started coming up because I had a less than perfect childhood, and suddenly I'm bouncing between these two things. I'm sort of having these awakening experiences that are coming sort of unasked for, just spontaneous, boom, I'm fucking one with everything. And then walking around in my young 20s self, and I feel really anxious, and I feel panic, and I feel neurotic, and the self-doubt, and just really pretty intense psychological stuff. So I ended up finding a Buddhist psychotherapist in Philadelphia in the 90s. No small feat, trust me. And he sort of began this process of like, like, okay, you've got spirituality over here and you've got therapy over here, and they're kind of doing their own things, right? So for me, this idea of spiritual practice and psychotherapy they've been together since the very beginning. Fast forward 8 or 9 years, 2007, I meet this crazy motherfucker named Junpo Dennis Kelly Roshi. He's the 83rd patriarch of Rinzai Zen. Super intense dude, but also really, really fucking funny. And a bit of a wild man. I wrote his memoir, A Heart Blown Open, which came out about 10 years ago. And really chronicles his life. He was like a severely abusive alcoholic home. His dad beat the shit out of him growing up. I mean, really, really beat the shit out of him growing up, and his brothers. And then he dropped out of high school, married his high school sweetheart, got her pregnant, abandoned the family, joined the mob, became part of the counterculture, became a major manufacturer of LSD, was dealing with a lot of narcissism and grandiose egoic ideas about changing the world and how powerful and special he was, and then was on the run for 5 years from the DEA, and then ended up in a federal prison, and then ended up in a monastery for 6 years where he really looked in. And what he discovered was that as he became more and more awake, none of that touched the wounds of his childhood. So the awakening process didn't illuminate or transform or didn't transmute the psychological shadows, the psychological trauma that he was holding. It remained completely intact. So he had a great saying. He used to say, the only trouble with Zen and with psychotherapy is they don't work. Which is a great thing to say, because it kind of pisses off all the Zen people, and it kind of pisses off all the therapy people. And so, it was one of his typical ornery statements that would sort of get people to lean in and get angry with him and to start to engage in dialogue, which is what he wanted. So let's just take a little step to the left. And if we talk about spirituality, what's the goal? Right? If you have a spiritual practice, what are you doing? Well, for some people, it's they kind of want to feel better about themselves, feel better about the world. But really the idea, I think most people would agree, is to kind of transcend your humanness in some way. So to get around the whole messy human thing. It's kind of why people do it. In Buddhism, the Buddha was actually very specific about what spirituality was about. The Buddha said that the goal of Buddhism is liberation from suffering, not liberation from being human, not liberation from pain, not liberation from old age, sickness, and dying. Those things remain. So this has caused a lot of confusion. The Buddha promised liberation from suffering. In fact, there's a great Zen teacher, Shinzing Yang. It's great. And he has a great sort of mathematical equation around suffering, which is suffering equals pain times resistance. Suffering equals pain times resistance. In other words, pain arises, I stub my toe, ow, it hurts. My girlfriend breaks up with me, ow, it hurts. The human thing, diarrhea, bad breath, heartbreak, overdue taxes, right? Kind of painful. But when we resist them, when I refuse to be with what is, when I refuse to be with the heartbreak or with the stub toe or with the diarrhea, I suffer because I resist what is. Okay. And we've all known people, and we've probably all been people that get lost trying to get away from their own suffering, right? They're trying to get away from suffering. And so they do all kinds of things to try to get away from it, get away from their humanness. Okay, so let's move over here. The goal of therapy. What's the goal of therapy? It's pretty straightforward. The goal of therapy is basically to increase your self-awareness. It's to increase awareness of your consciousness, of my Keithness, right? So what do? You do attachment work, right? Which is like your attachment style: secure, anxious, avoidant, disorganized. You do trauma work, you do talk therapy, you do somatic therapy, and these are all designed to help the ego break out of its neurotic and self-sabotaging cycles. And it's the ego really helping the ego to be a little more self-aware and a little bit healthier. And yet, you'll never be liberated from your suffering doing therapy. Never. You'll never be liberated from your suffering doing therapy. Not fucking ever. You know, and people get obsessed. They get obsessed with their therapy. You know, my trauma, 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 my trauma. Right? It never ends. The traumas never end. They're infinite. They go all the way down into the birthing process and into the womb. And, you know, if you're a karma person, maybe the trauma goes into past lives. Infinite trauma. Good luck if you want to try to fix all those traumas. So, okay. So the only trouble with Zen and with psychotherapy, as Junpo said, is they don't work. So what does that mean? What is he saying? And what am I trying to say here? Because I'm trying to take these ideas and run with them. So what he's saying is that there's no awakening from life. There's no being liberated from life. There's no awakening from life. There's no being liberated from life. When I had these experiences all through my 20s and 30s, these unity and liberation, these liberty, when I had these experiences throughout my 20s and 30s, these experiences of unity consciousness, I was free. I was free of my humanness when those would happen, completely free. Keith wasn't around. And with no Keith around, wasn't much of a problem. But I was free. I wasn't liberated. And it's a really important distinction. This is spiritual bypassing. This is how you actually would define spiritual bypassing. I go around my humanness to a place that feels like freedom. So this is not unlike people that get really wrapped up in doing ayahuasca, or really wrapped up in doing psilocybin therapy, or really wrapped up in doing anything where they're having an experience of being beyond themselves. It's not the experience that counts. It's not the experience that counts. It's the integration that counts. So the experiences that I had of unity consciousness, or the experiences that maybe you have on ayahuasca, to be frank, so fucking what? What does that mean in your marriage, in your work, in your life, how you treat the dog, right? How you show up? How do you integrate those things with your ego? So our egos try to keep what we find in these transcendent freedom experiences, right? I want to oh, I'm an awake person. No, you're not an awake person. I'm a spiritual person. I mean, maybe. You're probably an asshole some of the times, just like me. The trouble is, you're trying to awaken from life and be liberated from life. And you can only awaken through life. Through life. That means you need your ego. And guess what? That ego's fucked up. The ego probably needs therapy. Almost all of us do. Really, all of us do. I've never met someone that doesn't. So we awaken through the ego. So, look, I've worked with a lot of teachers, a lot of spiritual teachers over the years. And I've never known one, not one, that was so awake that they didn't have shadow. I've never known a shaman that was like that, or a guru, or a Buddhist teacher, or a rinpoche, or a lama, or whatever, right? The idea is they might be really fully awake and deeply spiritual, but they're also deeply human. There's no getting around it. So insights, spiritual insights, come through the ego. And if that ego is kind of fucked up, which most of them are, then the spiritual insight doesn't magically transform the ego. In time, it can help shift the ego, it can help mature the ego, soften the ego. But you're not awake. You are not awake. That's spiritual narcissism. I'm awake. I'm a spiritual person. You're not. Because the depth of what you're intuiting, the suchness, the awareness that's here right now, the awareness that's coming up, and that Keith is arising out of, that's what's awake. Awake. Awareness is awake. And I can rest in that. My Keithness can rest in this deeper place of awareness. But I can't claim it for myself. As soon as I do, spiritual bypassing, spiritual narcissism. So you're not awake. And part of the problem really is we view our teachers and our shamans and all these people, we have really, we project a lot of shit onto them. So Junpo told a great story. He was in Japan with his teacher, Edo Shamana Roshi, who had a lot of shadow. And he's touring around, and he meets this really renowned Rinzai Zen bishop, this sort of big Japanese guy. And he said to Junpo, "Oh, you Americans, why do you worship your teachers? Roshi just like plumber. You hire him to get the job done. That's it." So when you go to your spiritual teacher, or if you consider yourself a spiritual teacher, it's just a goddamn plumber. Your job is to get the shit out of people's pipes. That's it. Get over yourself. And let your teacher get over themselves by not worshiping them. So you can have a really deep spiritual insight, really profoundly and truly real. And you can have really profoundly deep and real psychological shadows. The depth of your insight is not going to awaken your trauma. It's not going to happen. You need therapy. The Buddha needs therapy. Because liberation is through life, through the ego, through us, through Sangha, through community. One more story. 2007, I met Junpo. And it was for this event that was at something called Boulder Integral here in Boulder. And it was an organization that was sort of designed to teach Ken Wilber's integral philosophy and work. And if you don't know Ken and don't know integral, it's not important. But the idea is we all went there and we were asked to answer a couple questions. Who we are, why we're there, what integral means to us. And we got put into these like quads, foursomes. And so I'm in a quad, and there's this old white dude with a shaved head and real piercing blue eyes sitting across from me. And and so he says, they call me Junpo these days. I'm supposed to be some kind of a Zen Roshi. I was like, oh shit, Zen Roshi. It's a big deal. And he says, a couple years ago, I started doing something I shouldn't have been doing. I started fucking somebody in my order, priest. And I fucked up her marriage, I fucked up my relationship, and I destroyed what I'd spent a lifetime building. And so now, at 64 years of age, I'm back in therapy doing this small self shit again. And so I'm here to see if Integral can explain what the fuck happened to me. Whoa. Radical honesty. It turned out that the Buddha needed therapy. I hope that's clarifying. I hope it's helpful. And I hope you enjoyed the book. Thanks for listening.